Good evening. Welcome to the April 5th, 2017 meeting of the Murfreesboro Planning Commission. We have a quorum present, so I'll call the meeting to order. First item on tonight's agenda is to approve the minutes of March 1st, 2017. Are there any additions or corrections to those minutes? Hearing none, I'll declare them approved as submitted. We have one guest I wanted to recognize tonight, Benjamin Hager. Benjamin, I think you're here representing Leadership Rutherford, so congratulations on joining that outstanding organization. I think you'll enjoy that. So thank you for coming tonight. Hope we don't bore you too bad. We have 4 public hearings scheduled for this evening, the first of which is a zoning application for approximately 4.8 acres located along Kings Highway and Bridge Avenue to be rezoned from RS8 to RD, which is approximately 1 acre, commercial highway to RD, which is approximately a half an acre, and heavy industrial to light industrial, approximately 3.3 acres. The Sword of the Lord Foundation is the applicant. Mr. Blomley, good evening, sir.
Good evening, Chairman Lamb, and good evening, members of the Planning Commission. Our first public hearing tonight is for the Sword of the Lord property located at the corner of Bridge Avenue and Kings Highway. Sword of the Lord approached planning staff about needing some additional housing on the properties that it owns along Kings Highway for its employees. They own 6 of the 7 parcels that are colored orange and blue on the map before us. 2 of those parcels are zoned commercial highway, and 5 of those parcels are zoned RS8. It's their intent to build 1 or more duplexes on those properties. Some of the properties are vacant, some of them have single-family homes on them, but they would like to build at least 1 duplex, perhaps more in the future, on those properties to house their employees. Some of the lots don't meet the minimum 8,000 square foot requirement for a duplex, but seeing as they own most of those lots, they can reallocate those property lines via re-subdivision plat to try to maximize the use on those parcels. There is one property that is kind of sandwiched in between properties that the Sword of the Lord owns. You'll see it's got the hatch marks in it along Kings Highway there. That's owned by Mr. Michael Barrett, I believe, and we tasked Sword of the Lord with approaching Mr. Barrett to see if he had any objection to his property being included in this rezoning, and I personally have not heard from him. The representative of Sword of the Lord that is here today has indicated that he received a favorable response from Mr. Barrett, and that Mr. Barrett had no objection to the rezoning. That's according to the applicant. So we have included that as additional study area for your consideration tonight. Also included in this rezoning is, as I mentioned, those 7 parcels, 5 of which are zoned RS8 and 2 of which are zoned CH, and those are requested for RD, residential duplex. And the purple area is currently zoned HI, heavy industrial, and it houses Sword of the Lord's main facility, which includes their offices, their bookstore, and their publishing facility. All of those uses can continue under the light industrial zoning district. There's no need for the heavy industrial zoning district if they desire to continue just those uses. So in an effort to be good neighbors to the surrounding area, the applicants are voluntarily requesting the down zone of their property from heavy industrial to light industrial, so that in the event that they sell their property in the future, that would eliminate some of the more intense industrial uses that would be permitted in the heavy industrial zone, especially considering the fact that directly across Bridge Avenue is the McFadden School of Excellence, as well as the McFadden Community Center, and directly across Kings Highway are single-family residential uses and 2-family residential uses. The RD zoning for the parcels along Kings Highway are not unheard of for the area. As you can see, just to the west of the subject property, there is RD zoning already in the area, and to the north of the subject property along Kings Highway is RM16 zoning, which is where the Midtown Estates apartment complex is located, right across from Quality Furniture. To the east of the subject property and to the north is an area zoned heavy industrial, and there's kind of a hodgepodge of industrial and commercial uses there in that area along Cannon Avenue. With that being said, we'll need to conduct a public hearing on this rezoning request tonight and formulate a recommendation for the City Council. Mr. Charles Stukenborg is here representing Sword of the Lord if you have any questions for him. And other than that, I'll be happy to answer any questions as well.
Okay. Does the applicant have anything they'd like to add?
No, sir. I believe they're just here if you have any questions for them.
Okay. Any questions from the Planning Commission before we open the public hearing? Okay. Before I open the public hearing, I'll briefly go over the rules we conduct the public hearing by. We'll open the public hearing, ask anybody to come forward to speak. Please come to the podium, speak to the microphone, state your name and address if you would for the record. Keep your comments to no more than 3 minutes and make all your questions to the Planning Commission. If you have questions, we'll try to get them answered at the conclusion of the public hearing. All that being said, I'll ask anybody to come forward that would like to speak. Nobody? Okay. In that case, I'll close the public hearing. Are there questions by members of the Planning Commission? If not, we're ready for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I make the motion to approve subject staff comments.
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carried.
Chairman Lamb, if I could get a clarification, that is to include the additional parcel as well?
Yes, sir.
It was
Thank you.
included in the whole.
Yes, yes.
Yes. So, yes, sir.
Thank you.
Okay. Item B is the PUD amendment for approximately 17.3 acres to amend the Victory Station PUD. Swanson Development is the applicant. Mr. Anthony, good evening, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. Swanson Development wishes to amend the Victory Station PUD, specifically parcels U and V, which represent about 17.3 acres located east of Rucker Lane, south of Highway 96. This would be behind the Publix shopping center. In 2006, this property was given entitlements, 32 live-work units, 40 townhomes, and 60,000 square feet of flex space, which could be commercial or office space. The request tonight is for a revision to those entitlements to 87 townhomes, a 67,000 square foot assisted living center, and a 10,000 square foot flex space for commercial or office use. The Planning Commission should hold a public hearing this evening, formulate a recommendation to the City Council. Clyde Roundtree from Huddleston Steel and Joe Swanson from Swanson Development are both here and can speak more about this request, and staff can answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Roundtree, do you have anything?
Thank you, Chairman Lamb, Commissioners. My name is Clyde Roundtree with Huddleston Steel Engineering. I'm here with Mr. Swanson, representing this UV development for the redevelopment for the Victory Station. And really, I thought the best way to describe what we're actually doing is for you to see it. Really, there's as Anthony Donald mentioned, it's really basically a reallocation of very similar program elements. The biggest contrast is that due to market, kind of the transition in the market, we're going much more towards a single-family attached homes on the on parcel U, and then on V, versus just being a general commercial type of application. Mr. Swanson's had some interest from assisted living, being an occupant for the 66,000 square foot space that's identified in yellow, and then there's the 10,000 square foot is really is basically a flex space, is what we're calling the pattern book. But you can see how the kind of the allocations lines for those parcels were kind of juxtaposed. We kind of changed the direction to align ourselves with the main entry drive going through the property. So that made a lot of sense from a planning standpoint. Pretty much the same acreage allocations, very similar in terms of overall density, but just kind of a shift based on market trends. If you have any questions for me or Mr. Swanson, we're both available to answer anything we can.
Okay. Any questions for Mr. Roundtree before we open the public hearing? Thank you, Clyde. In that case, I'll open the public hearing, ask anybody to come forward that'd like to speak. Seeing no one come forward, I'll close the public hearing. Questions or comments from members of the Planning Commission?
Seeing none, Mr. Chairman, I recommend approval.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. Next item is proposed amendments to the zoning ordinance regarding Section 31, wireless telecommunication towers and antennas, Section 9, standards for special permit uses, Section 27, landscaping and screening, Table 2, buffer zone requirements, Chart 4, required off-street parking and queuing spaces used by use, and Chart 1, uses permitted by the zoning district, City of Murfreesboro Planning and Legal Departments. That's the applicant, Mr. Plumley.
Thank you, Chairman Lamb. Much like last month, we brought kind of a group of miscellaneous amendments to the zoning ordinance. We're really trying to be diligent about improving our ordinance and being proactive when we find something in our ordinance that we feel needs to be changed. We try to take an opportunity to amend the ordinance, and many of these amendments we think are things that make the ordinance more user friendly in some instances, and some are changes that are required due to other circumstances, and I'll get into some of those here in a moment. But just to go over a couple of these miscellaneous changes to the zoning ordinance, the first one, the biggest one that takes up the bulk of the amendment, is something that I'll yield to Mr. Ives here in just a moment. But we have amendments, kind of some housekeeping amendments to Section 27, landscaping and screening. Mr. Kane Adams and Mr. Brad Barbie are here. They are kind of the boots on the ground folks in our urban environmental department every day who administer our landscape ordinance, and there are things that they notice in their positions, that things that could be improved, and so there are some changes to Section 27. Another change dealing with landscaping is with regards to Table 2 buffer zone requirements. In an effort to make Table 2 more user-friendly to designers, to eliminate confusion when they're trying to design the required landscape buffers, Mr. Adams and Mr. Barbie have worked together to improve that table, to make it more user-friendly, and so this amendment includes replacing the existing table and with a new table. Also, we have added some uses in and revised some of the of Chart 4, required off-street parking and queuing spaces by use, including providing parking standards for movie theaters, which we always struggle with. We actually don't have a parking formula for movie theaters, and this will allow us to include that in there. Then there are a number of changes to Chart 1, uses permitted, and I'll go over a few of those. Perhaps one that requires the most explanation is with regards to something that is affectionately known as the Jackson Law. Jackson Law is a state law which gives gives municipalities the authority to regulate landfills within 1 mile of the city boundaries. So landfills that are located within 1 mile of our city limits, we can regulate. And so our city council in December passed a resolution opting in to that provision in state law, And a copy of that resolution has been provided in the agenda materials. So, but that kind of left us with the question is, how do we implement that? And what's the appropriate body? Well, in discussing that with our legal department, it seems that the board or commission that would seem most suited with a process to hear a situation like that would be the Board of Zoning Appeals, because it's almost tantamount to a special use permit that these landfills would be asking for. And so we propose a footnote in the zoning ordinance to Chart 1 that says that landfills that qualify under this provision of state law will be required to obtain a special use permit and meet the same standards as would be required for landfills that are in the city limits. As a companion piece to that, the footnote also says that they must receive site plan approval from the Planning Commission. So it would basically be the same process that a use that would require a special use permit in the city limits would go before the Board of Zoning Appeals for the special use permit and then the Planning Commission for site plan approval. So that is one proposed amendment to Chart 1. Another proposed amendment to Chart 1 is dealing with warehousing and distribution centers. Right now, warehousing and distribution centers are permitted uses in the CH zone. In staff's opinion, this is more of an industrial use, even though it's permitted in the commercial highway zone. So we're proposing that warehousing and distribution facilities be allowed in the light industrial and heavy industrial zones, but that use be not permitted in the commercial highway zones. And we've also added a movie theater entry into Chart 1 of the zoning ordinance as well. And that brings us to changes with regards to telecommunications facilities that Mr. Ives is going to go into. He has worked very, very hard on them.
Thank you, Matthew. Chairman, members of the Planning Commission. The first portion of the amendments that's before you does deal with cell towers. We have a fairly long introduction to that, which is somewhat unusual, but that introduction is intended to help us establish the legal basis for these changes in the event that we are challenged in court sometime in the future. Essentially, these whereas clauses are the why for why we're doing what we're doing with the ordinance amendments. Section 1 of the amendment, which starts on page 2, adopts into the zoning ordinance a new Section 31, and that section will establish policies, procedures, requirements for all wireless telecommunications towers, and of course there's a number of exceptions. But with respect to those not exempted or accepted from this requirement, all the cell towers will require a special use permit from the BZA. 31, this section will specify what has to be included in an application to put up a cell tower, and the general standards that the BZA is going to need to find have been met in order to put up a cell tower. Essentially, I think what we've put into Section 31 formalizes what we've effectively been doing in the past on cell towers. And again, I'm talking now about the 150, 300-foot macro, so-called macro cell towers. There's not a significant change. There are some, but it'll formalize it. And one of the reasons to formalize it was so that we could then exempt out what we would do for, among other things, small cells. So one of the new elements put into Section 31 is authorizing the planning director to retain an outside independent expert at the cost of the applicant if there are technical issues in the application that our city staff really can't address. And just as a real brief example, if a cell tower is proposed to be located at a certain location and someone objecting to it claims that and provides some rational information to say that the tower would actually produce the desired result better at a different location, planning director could retain an independent expert to analyze both parties' data and make a recommendation to the BZA. Quite obviously, we don't have anybody on city staff that's competent, I don't think, to analyze those kinds of coverage questions or radio frequency questions that might be involved in something like that. So far in past here, I don't think we've really had those kinds of technical issues, but as it gets more crowded, there's certainly a possibility that that would come up. That's included in a number of zoning ordinances, including our colleagues at Rutherford County have that provision in their fairly new zoning ordinance that was adopted just a few years ago. The exemptions to these general requirements are contained in subsection G to zoning ordinance section 31, and that's starts on page 6 of the amendment. It would exempt out of these general requirements, first of all, regular maintenance of a tower. They won't need to go to the BZA to get a permit to do maintenance or repairs on an existing tower. We're establishing the basic criteria for a small cell of nothing more than 45 feet from ground level. So anything that's proposed to be not more than 45 feet above ground would be exempted. We're providing for a tower of any kind put up under a state of emergency, whether it's federal, state, or local. If someone feels a need because of a tornado, because of some other emergency to put up a temporary tower of some kind, they would not need to go to the BZA for that. Of course, we're exempting satellite dishes and other TV reception for private home use. Amateur radio facilities, ham radio towers are not required. There's also a vehicle called a cow, a cell on wheels. And essentially what that is a cell tower that's mounted onto a trailer. They bring it in, somewhat much like the newscasters can do here in town, where they have an antenna they can raise up from the back of their van. These are a little more exotic, sometimes at least. I'm not sure we'll ever need one of those in Murfreesboro. It would certainly be a large gathering at Titan Stadium, for example. Someone might want to bring in a temporary tower to provide more capacity without the need to go ahead and put on a permanent one. So that kind of a use for up to 30 days would not have to go to the BZA. That could be approved by the planning director.
Now, if MTSU wanted to bring one in, that wouldn't apply.
I'm sorry?
If MTSU wanted to bring one in or something like that, that wouldn't apply.
On their property,
Yeah.
It probably would not. They're generally exempt from
Okay.
those kinds of zoning regulations.
But that's really referring to something more like a Bonnaroo type event where you've got a very temporary, massive crowd in an area that would need a large amount of cell phone coverage.
Correct.
And it would go away 2 weeks later. The demand is completely gone. So I think that's primarily what you're looking at in that.
I think, yes, you're right. I think generally in a stadium, if they felt the need for more coverage, they'd install some permanent small cells of some kind. On the other hand, if you're going to do a rock concert at Floyd Field and you're expecting 50,000 people as opposed to the normal 10,000 people that are at a football game, you might want to bring in a tower of that nature, temporary tower.
Now, wait a minute, Mr. Ives. It's not 10,000 people. Okay.
There's more? How many more?
Please proceed.
The small cell facilities themselves, as again, it's something that's going to be under 45 feet tall, have a special provision here in subsection G. Now, there is one, to back up a second, for generally we're proposing to not allow small cell towers to be installed in residential areas. And a prohibited area, for example, will be in front of a 1 to 4 family property. Mostly we feel these should be in the commercial, industrial, high density office situations, not in residential areas. However, there's certainly a possibility, well, in our residential zoned areas, we have a number of institutional group assemblies, schools, some athletic facilities, and churches. There's certainly a possibility that any one of those might want to have a small cell facility on their property, or a carrier might want to put one on their property, and they want to approve. So to put a small cell in a group assembly use in the residential area, you will need to go to the BZA. And then generally, though, in commercial, industrial, office zones, the small cells would be approved at a staff level by the planning director. They would, of course, have to have a building permit for that, too, so there would be that checked. If what would generally be considered a small cell has a need or a desire to be above 45 feet, they would need to go to the BZA for that. But if it's 45 feet tall or less, it would be approved at the staff level. Then the next two sections in this amendment, but Section 9 of the current zoning ordinance, 9D, establishes a number of additional requirements for specific uses that require a special use permit. The first, Section 2 in the amendment, would amend the requirements for large cell towers to be consistent with the new Section 31. And then Section 3 will establish requirements that need to be met by an applicant who wants to put a small cell in an institutional group assembly use. And with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? I don't think anybody knows enough to be able to ask a good question.
I've been working on this a long time, and I'm not sure I do yet either.
We appreciate the work you guys do on that, because that's so technical that it takes a long time to be able to figure out exactly what proposals you need to come up with. So thank you for your time that you spend on that.
David, aren't what we are proposing here pretty much what you're going to see in every city in the future, though, with these small towers going up on poles? And
they are. A number of them, perhaps the largest group will be in our next discussion, which is poles on the right-of-way. What we've been talking about would be poles that would be, for instance, in a private light pole in a shopping center, or attached to the side or top of a building, a private building. So this, again, would be right-of-way usage, and I think that most of them are going to be in the right-of-way. But certainly there's going to be some. We already have 2 that I know of for sure, and maybe 3 that are attached to the front or side of a building, and driving by you would not know what they are. They look like it's a piece of the building decoration, but it's actually a cell, an antenna for providing cell service.
And the driving force behind all this is data usage. These things are going to be popping up everywhere because of our reliance on the data on our phones now.
Okay. If there's no other questions, I'll open the public hearing. Ask anybody to come forward that'd like to speak.
Disappointed.
Yeah.
no huge public outrage.
Seeing no one come forward, I'll close the public hearing. Any questions from the Planning Commission? No, we're ready for a motion.
Move for approval, subject to all staff comments.
Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed. Motion carries. Item D, proposed amendments to subdivision regulations and street design specifications regarding telecommunications equipment and fiber optic cable and public right-of-way. City of Murfreesboro Legal Department is the applicant. Once again, Mr. Ives.
Thank you, sir, and ladies and gentlemen. This, the companion to what we just talked about, is to provide some guidance and regulation on the placement of small cells in the right-of-way. Under our state statutes dating back to the late 1800s, the telecommunication company has the legal right to put facilities in the right-of-way. Cities have some, and towns, counties have at least some ability to regulate that, but we cannot prohibit it. If there's room, if it's technically and physically feasible, we cannot prohibit them from being in our right-of-way. But as I said, we can provide some reasonable regulations. Again, we're making the demarcation point 45 feet. And that's obviously that's it's a specific requirement. You could argue that it should be 30 feet or it should be 50 feet, but that's what we're proposing at this time is 45 feet. We're also proposing that if there are a number of poles in the right-of-way that, let's say, for instance, are 35 feet, that you can't go over the 35 feet. It's whichever's, the existing poles or 45 feet, whichever is lower. We want the first place to put them on existing electric poles or streetlight poles, if that's feasible, if they're in the area and if it's feasible. Obviously, if they go on electric poles, along with our regulations, they will have to have a pole attachment agreement, which we're finalizing now. It's different from the pole attachment agreement that they use when they attach fiber-optic cable or some other kind of cable to a pole. Putting the antenna on a pole will require a separate special agreement. But we want to use existing poles when possible. MED is aware of this. Of course, to some extent, they don't want anything on either poles. They understand that they have to allow this to the extent, again, that it's feasible. We can reserve the poles for power first. If there's no room on a pole for an antenna, then they can't put one there. There would be a provision in that agreement where the applicant can, as is currently the case with attaching fiber optic cables to poles, if there's not room, the applicant can pay to have a taller pole put in to provide more room so that they can put their facility on. That's not a cost to the utility, that's a cost to the applicant if they need to do that. I think that's really the primary in terms of the antenna attachments. We want, if they put up a new pole, if there's no space available, they're going to have a right to put up a pole. We have at least some ability to prohibit new poles for instance, along Med Center Parkway, where all the utilities are underground. We will fight very hard to get them to put something on a side street. And again, if it's technically impossible to get the coverage without having something on Mid Center Parkway, then we will do our best to camouflage it to make it as unobtrusive as is possible. It is a possibility that we would ultimately be forced to allow something on Mid Center Parkway. Initially, we're going to prohibit putting them on traffic signal elements. They are in some places placed on traffic signal poles, and it certainly is a possibility if we get to a crunch and the option is to put in a new pole someplace or retrofit a traffic signal pole for the antenna. I would expect we'll be modifying this to retrofit the traffic signal pole. But I think that's pretty much it for the. We will require that the facilities be concealed to the extent possible. We've seen installations where there's wires hanging out all over the place, very, very shoddy installations that have been done in places, and we will provide in this ordinance that they have to have the facility neat, conceal it, cover it up to the extent possible, and have it look good for the community. With respect to underground fiber optic cable, it's somewhat the same thing. They have the right, if there's room in the right-of-way, they have an absolute right to put fiber optic cable underground, and to a large extent, we'd rather have it underground than overhead. But we will be having capacity issues. There's only so many feet in outside the pavement. I don't think they're going to want to go to the cost of digging up pavement to put in a pole. And I'm not sure we'd have to let them, but there's only so much room, and with water, sewer, gas, other telephone, other telegraph, other communication spaces, we have a issue of running out of room. To some extent, we're going to look at requiring that when one gets installed, that they install a larger conduit than they need, so that there's room for another person to come in later and pull a wire through that same conduit. That has not been included in this at this point. This was a new piece of data that we received just recently. We're looking at adding that to it.
Okay.
Again, on both of these, we looked at, and there's some communities are approaching these as franchises. One of the things that's clear is we cannot charge these folks a franchise fee of something like, say, 5%, like we charge to Comcast or to other cable television. We can charge them a reasonable fee based on cost. We have not yet attempted to establish that fee. I'm not sure how we would. I think it'd be very expensive to hire the consultants to come up with a fee like that. I'm not sure we'd ever recover the cost of the consultants. But in any event, at this point at least, we're not charging them a fee. But we will require that they enter into basically a master agreement, a master license agreement, as opposed to a franchise agreement. Very similar in that it will require, it'll set the requirements for what they have to do and what they can't do in installing these facilities in the right way.
Any questions? Yes, sir, Mr. Plumley.
Chairman Lamb, we'll need to conduct a public hearing on this, but state law gives the Planning Commission authority to adopt subdivision regulations, which the street design specs are kind of under the umbrella of the subdivision regulations. So you have the authority to adopt the actual document, and then any amendments thereto. So the Planning Commission, the action that the Planning Commission takes tonight, we'll take it to the City Council to ratify that action, but the Planning Commission's action on subdivision regulations is final.
Any questions for Mr. Ives or Mr. Blumley? Thank you. I'll open the public hearing. Is there anybody that would like to speak? Seeing no one come forward, I'll close the public hearing. Questions?
David, I know they installed one of the, it almost looks like a cap on a fireplace out at MTSU the other day on top of one of the poles, and it was a cell phone signal. I stopped and talked to the guys about it. It was a cell phone antenna. And in conversation with them, I mean, it really wasn't that intrusive. I mean, it almost looks like a cap on top of the telephone pole. So some of these antennas are very, very well designed so that they're not, I mean, truthfully, the transformers that are hanging on our telephone poles are more intrusive, I think, than what this cap was. So it doesn't look like that significant a change as far as the appearance or what we'd be seeing.
There is a variety.
Right.
And I agree with you. Many of them, and many of the providers are conscious of public relations, and you know, they want their facility to look good. They don't want to cause trouble. They don't want to cause you know, people to be looking and saying, "Geez, that's ugly. We hate that company for what they put up." And some of them are not so much that. So there is a variety.
Yeah, we actually had a company out on the corner of Thompson Lane and Medical Center Parkway that put one basically into the front of their building in their design, and you can't even tell it's a tower there. So, so some of them, you know, are being really creative with how they put them up, and truly, as long as it's done tastefully, I don't think we've got that big a threat. My bigger concern, I think, is where there might not be a pole at all, where we've made an effort to put underground utilities in place, and then someone comes along. And I would hope that at some point, like Medical Center Parkway, that we could almost encourage them to go to some of the taller buildings out there and say, listen, you'd be better off on this building than you would be on the roadway. So
if we're faced with that, we will certainly explore all the options with them and attempt to come up with something that does not distract from our gateway design criteria.
If there's no other questions, we're ready for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion for approval.
Motion's been seconded. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries. That concludes the public hearing portion of our agenda. Staff reports and other business. Mr. Whitaker?
Chairman, I have none this evening.
Nobody?
I've said all I can say.
In that case, we stand adjourned.